on Long Island in New York named John Gatto, and he called about 10 years ago to beg me to find a way to separate my name from his. He said I paid my life savings, $10,000, to buy this job from the local political club. I hope you realize that's how these administrative jobs and schooling are passed out. And he said, and now no one will talk to me. So I became John Taylor Gatto after a distant relative of my mother's, Frederick Taylor, who probably was the single most damaging figure in world history in the last 200 years. He created time and motion studies where work, you know what those are. For if you don't know, an engineer comes and watches you closely, including in the bathroom, for days, and then he writes up that a second could be saved if you pick your nose with your left hand instead of your right. I'm not exaggerating. They rationalize your movements to save time for your employer. Otherwise, as it was explained to us at the Rockwell manufacturing plant in Bellefontaine, Ohio, where my uncle was the CEO, it's like stealing time from your employer. So do your best to rationalize all your movements. The route you take to go to the company toilet can be rationalized. If you avoid this desk where you always stop to say hello and pass that desk where they hate you, that's 5 seconds right there. Times 5 days a week, times a 40-year working career. Hi, so I'm John Taylor Gatto, at least I am today, and I thank you very much for the honor of coming to this room at Macalester College. As I told my host, I'd heard of Macalester and the little liberal arts colleges out this way, like Coe, and there's probably a dozen others that are really the muscle of the liberal arts philosophy in the United States. All the major universities have pushed to the back burner any idea that things like justice or human rights exist at all. They're all creatures of the new pragmatic movement. But I understand that Macalester, are any of you here from Macalester? That you actually are allowed to think and argue and have a different point of view. Well, this talk has a name, Death by Pedagogy. And it has 2 parts. The first part is losing coherence, and the second part is called the German disease. So rather than risk offending anybody here who derives from a Germanic background, I want you to know that my mother was so German that her father used to stand in the middle of the street near Pittsburgh during World War II calling for German victory. I can tell you that made my elementary schooling very, very problematical, since no one dared tackle my grandfather. He was a town printer, and he loved to defame people and run off thousands of copies of it. But I had to walk about a mile to school, so I was the proxy to be beaten for my German. Anyway, so Death by Pedagogy, and I have one minor apology. I work on these talks, and this will be the first time this has ever been given, continually, right up to this morning, when I seem to have entered something more than 1,500 changes in this script. So, if you see me working from a script, it's not because I couldn't put this aside, order the doors locked, and talk incessantly to you for 10 or 12 hours. In West Virginia an audience once kept me without any notes for 6 hours, and they'd never eaten off a tablecloth. So this is for your protection, that I don't ad-lib and stick to this newly minted script. Without any further ado, losing coherence. My mental equilibrium was shocked profoundly in the year 2007, in the months of January, March, and November of that year, by public disclosures that the America I would prefer to believe I live in, and America I came to love growing up during World War II, had morphed into something else right under my nose. The Financial Times of London, which is a pretty muscular newspaper that big shots with money in the stock market read, started the ball rolling on its editorial page January the 24th, 2007. It charged that the United States had betrayed its founding principles to the extent it was, quote, losing its coherence, close quote. Lest we soon figured out a good reason for being a nation at all, the visible disintegration of the American Commonwealth would continue. The editorial implication was clear that the bombing of poor people and making bankers and drug companies rich wasn't enough to keep a country together. To be a nation, I was instructed by the Brits, a political aggregation must function like an extended family. At first, that made me angry. Who were Brits, after all, to adopt a lofty moral tone when most of the intractable problems on planet Earth can be traced directly to the British Empire? Everyone else in the world knows that. We're not allowed to mention that in school. How could our nation be incoherent? Mentally disturbed men and women are incoherent. My desk is hardly ever coherent. But my country bothered me. I pushed the disturbing notion out of mind, but it kept returning. Was this the way to account for the many surprising developments ever since the Eisenhower presidency? 2 of our presidents in that interval have been run out of office. Ronald Reagan, announcing himself as a conservative, tripled the size of American government. That really bewildered me. I was one of the founders of the New York State Conservative Party, but I left the party because all of the members seemed to me like Mr. Reagan, wild-eyed radicals claiming they were conservatives, in exactly the way that George Orwell in 1984 said the leadership had to do. It had to preempt the language of the people it disliked so they would be left bereft of a way to communicate their ideas. Anyway, back to the script. See what happens if I add it. So other strange things that seemed to me to have happened that were unfamiliar to the pre-Eisenhower America that I grew up in were these. Suddenly I learned we were maintaining overseas prison camps without knowledge of the voters, and that we had reserved the right legislatively to attack countries that don't attack us first. Now, I certainly know a catalog of nations that reserved that right to themselves since Genghis Khan, but I didn't think we were one of them. It's not a rumor, though. It's the law. If the president says attack, you attack. What else would you do? Argue with him? So, another thing that bothered me was that our world-dominant auto industry, after World War II, nobody built cars. They built 1,000 cars. You know, we owned the car business worldwide, and a river of money poured into our country. But we seem to be utterly unable to improve our vehicles, while the Japanese improved their vehicles yearly, and a number of other countries did too. I still was bewildered of that, by the way, until about a year ago, when I actually gave a talk at General Motors in Detroit, and a mid-level engineer told me what had happened. Sometime after the Second World War, the amounts of cash coming into the corporation were so enormous that the Harvard Business School was called in to tell Ford, GM, and Chrysler what to do with all this money. Should they use it perfecting their vehicles? They were told flatly, what a crazy idea. You can get into speculating in foreign currencies and underwriting variable rate mortgages and make twice as much as you can make as an auto builder. So then the engineer said, actually improving the line of product became a dead end if you wanted to rise in corporate management. No one was interested in that waste of money. You didn't get enough payback from it. And the mystery was solved. The rationality of Harvard Business School had struck and shown General Motors how to make much more money speculating in money rather than, oh, they still built cars for the morons, but the morons gradually caught on that Japan actually was building cars that didn't break down every week. So anyway, don't let me ad-lib one more time. So attacking countries that didn't attack us first, we had allowed enormous banks with many privileges, including the privilege of printing money, of creating money out of air, to indulge in colossal financial speculations. They weren't making enough by charging interest on loans and fees. We had franchised out by 1972 to 23,000 American schools the school lunch program to fast food empires like McDonald's and Taco Bell. And we suddenly, just a few years ago, began to witness the overnight collapse of gigantic American corporations like Enron, the 7th largest corporation in the world, which in a blink of an eye was just gone. How could that happen? Merrill Lynch encouraged people, as the stock dropped 10 or 20 points a day, quick buy, because surely it will recover. But it went straight down and vanished without a trace, leaving tens of thousands of pensions gone forever, and old codgers like me and old crones like my wife destitute, causing damage that resulted in many, many suicides, broken homes, children who repudiated their parents. And then WorldCom, Lehman, Bear Stearns, and many more, all gone. So, are we losing it? Are we becoming incoherent? And if we are, what connection between national disintegration and the way we school our young people? You'll find I'm very stingy about using the word education. It does not occur by design in any public school in the United States, and it doesn't occur in most private schools, although there is an elite cadre that does it. So 24 years ago, a college professor from Virginia named E.D. Hirsch wrote a best-selling book, Cultural Literacy. And in it he said that school leaders had imposed incoherence on the curriculum. They created subjects without any pattern or purpose to them. He said that schools had numbed the minds of their captive student audience, and when intellect is paralyzed, incoherent decision-making cannot be very far away. So that was my January dose. On March 26th of 2007, Time magazine published a BBC poll of 28,389 respondents from 29 countries around the world who answered the question, what 5 nations in order have the best influence on world affairs? And the winner overwhelmingly was a country from North America. But it wasn't us. It was Canada. And then they asked, what 5 nations in the world had the worst influence on the planet? And another nation from North America was in that group. The bottom 3, we weren't the bottom. That was Israel. We weren't next to the bottom. That was Iran. We were 3rd up from the bottom of 129 countries. That was the good old USA. I grew to manhood in the golden decade after World War II, when America was admired almost everywhere. So I admit to being disturbed by the existence of this virtually universally negative opinion. How did that happen? What could account for this dramatic shift in global respect? I know Mr. Bush said they were envious of us, but I travel in China and Malaysia quite a bit, in Australia, and I can guarantee you, envy's not the word for what they feel. What could account for this dramatic shift? The BBC accused America of an absence of fair-mindedness, of a disdain for morality, preferring legalism to the real thing. They called us, that's the BBC, they hypocrites. They said we were the world's bullies, and if there was any terrorist nation afoot in the world, that everyone knew that it was under the Stars and Stripes. And all these things are shocking to one of the founders of the New York State Conservative Party. But I was raised to be open-minded, to want to hear the full argument. And the next shoe dropped on November 30th of 2007, when the U.S. Department of Justice issued figures showing that America had the highest rate of imprisonment on planet Earth. Of 197 countries surveyed, it was 6 times higher than China's. That really threw me for a loop. You mean the commies didn't lock people up anywhere near the extent to which we did? I learned it was 6 times likelier to end up in confinement as an American citizen than it would be for a Chinese living in China. I admit to finding that a horrifying notion. Not in the land of the free, I thought. Surely not there. Is locking up so many of our own citizens a sign of incoherence? And if it isn't, what is it then? Now let's move on to medicine. This strikes close to home because my wife has serious medical conditions that require a fortune be spent every year in medicine. Fortunately, I don't spend that fortune because I fly to San Diego, rent a car, and drive into Mexico, where I buy the medicine she needs for 1/3 of the U.S. cost. And let's go a little beyond that. It's packed in the same packages and made by the same companies that sell it to me for triple the price in New York City. How's that possible? Is fleecing your sick a sign of national incoherence? Last year, the TV program 60 Minutes did a segment on medical tourism. Has anyone in here been a medical tourist yet? Turns out there are state-of-the-art medical facilities in India and other countries that will do quadruple bypass and anything else you can think of at 25% of the U.S. cost, and then they will give you an expenses-paid vacation anywhere in the world you want to go to recuperate. And 60 Minutes was in some of these hospitals. They were to die for. Gourmet food. Well, okay. So my question repeated is fleecing your own sick a sign of national incoherence? Now let's take military affairs. 9,000 young Americans, most all of them from poor families, are dead, and over 35,000 crippled as a result of our unprovoked attack on the sovereign nation of Iraq. Trillions of dollars have been diverted from the productive economy to pay for this adventure, and more money to pay for a similar adventure in the mountains of Afghanistan. When we expelled the prior government of Afghanistan by military force, the price of heroin and other drugs around the world had skyrocketed to the point where millions of people couldn't afford their fix because whatever crimes the previous government had committed, it had wiped out the world's major source of heroin. By harsh means, it's true. However, after we militarily occupied the country, the prices plummeted down. It's never been so cheap because oceans of the stuff are coming out under the American. Now, I'm not suggesting we intended that. There's a smart aleck expression called unintended consequences that academic types like to dicker in. Of course, you probably haven't heard of this interesting fluctuation in the heroin market because somebody doesn't want you to hear about it. That's my guess. Is it incoherent to send thousands of our fellow citizens to die, tens of thousands to be permanently maimed for reasons beyond the ordinary comprehension of the people? It's against the will of the citizenry in a supposed democracy. Is that a sign of radical incoherence? 53% of all U.S. doctoral degrees in science and engineering go to foreign nationals. If you get out to Silicon Valley, 35% of all the tech firms are owned by Chinese or Indian nationals. Major building contracts are being filled by foreign firms at approximately 17% of the American price. And while they don't do the job better than we do it, they don't do it worse either. Bill Gates, without a college diploma to his name, quietly set up training campuses in India and China about 10 years ago to train personnel for his own operation. He also spends millions of dollars every year lobbying the U.S. government to increase the number of, I think they're called H-1A passports. Is that what it is? Yeah. Which allow foreign nationals to come in and stay for years occupying the jobs. They could go to American engineering graduates, but they want money, benefits, pension, and Mr. Gates and a whole lot of other people would prefer not to pay that scale, since they can get it cheaper. Is bleeding jobs from your own society and sending them abroad to save on labor costs a socially incoherent policy? America is by far the fattest nation on earth. 60% of the population is overweight, 30% obese, and those figures come directly from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. In a time when basic foodstuffs went up 36% in Egypt last year, which is the real cause of what you're seeing on television. And food riots are breaking out all over the world because the rapidly escalating cost of food, now that factory agriculture produces almost all of it, there's no need to be competitive in pricing. So what is the significance of the leading cause of medical problems in the United States being overweight? What message is that sending to the hungry of the world? Will they be our friends and love us? 16% of the American military, the active military, is obese. 9 million kids between the ages of 6 and 18 are obese. Diabetes has now penetrated the 5-year-old barrier and is headed down to preschool. The leading cause of diabetes is bad diet and inactivity, fats, sugars, and salts. Those, of course, are the leading components of all the fast food empires in America, and for good reason. They're addictive. 1 in 3 kids born after the year 2000 will develop diabetes. I have it myself. It's the leading cause of blindness and amputations in America because of diets rich in fats, salts, and sugars, and because the schooling of the young, instead of educating them, demands they be immobilized for many years. So I told you earlier that 23,000 schools have fast food franchises serving the lunch, Mega Meals and the Big Gulp. Big Gulp has 38 teaspoons of sugar in it. Is poisoning children to swell the profit picture of fast food empires a sign of incoherence? Is telling our young to sit down and shut up really a sane thing to do? What fraction of America's incoherence arises from our ongoing romance with Prussian-inspired schooling. That's schooling dedicated to fashioning obedient employees, men and women, deprived of any necessary practice in developing independence, creativity, self-reliance, resourcefulness, dialectical competency, which passes as critical thinking, and other characteristics of successful personal liberty. How does our dysfunctional schooling figure into this incoherence thing? Our schooling was intentionally designed to reciprocate with the economy. It isn't about education in the traditional sense at all, and it never was after its institutionalization. Pedagogy is increasingly dysfunctional, and our economy is increasingly dysfunctional. Our economy produces many things and services which nobody needs, and advertising exists because there's a lot of common sense in ordinary people, and nobody really wants these things. They have to be exhorted or tickled by advertising in order to want these things. The great, this is an ad lib, but it's worth it. The great profound transformation that took place in business between the 1870s and today is that prior to that time, an old-fashioned concept called the law of supply and demand was supposed to prevail, and it probably did. But sometime after the rise of the German psychologies, the hard ones and the soft clinical ones, it suddenly dawned on the managerial mind that you didn't have to wait for people to want something. You could create wants, and then you could fulfill those synthetic wants. You could even buy anything at all in the world that you could get for a steal, dirt cheap, and then fashion products out of it and create wants, and the public would say, I want two. Sorry, I can't give you two. They're so scarce. Okay, so I'm talking about the nature of our dysfunctional economy. It's an economy dependent upon war-making. We build the weaponry for both sides in every country around the world. Although Sweden, cheeky Sweden, and arrogant France have been stealing some of that business. How dare they? When a war breaks out, count on the fact it's being fought on both sides by American weapons, bullets, bombs. And what a business. Is it the dream of a good businessman? You're selling things that destroy themselves. They have to be reordered, don't they? What a product. What do you think? You know? Anyway, so we depend upon war-making. It's our number 2 source of foreign income. On legal drug vending, that's charging 3 times as much to Americans as you do when you sell it to Mexico. Low nutrition factory agriculture. I guess some of you, because this is a healthier part of the country, realize that the nutrients in things like a common carrot or a potato, when they're grown by mass production methods, have a nutritional value about 40% below the ones you grow in your garden at home. So people can stuff themselves with calories and end up with deficiency diseases, which makes business, after all, for the medical racket. One of our biggest businesses, and we're still the best at it in the world, is financial trickery. Our economy is based on the continuous creation of bubbles. Now, you've all lived through, and some of you have been punished by the housing bubble. But that's one in a long line of bubbles, and the bubbles being set up right now, let me tell you what they'll be. There'll be the alternative fuel bubble. There'll be the environmental cleansing bubble. I don't mean these things don't need to happen. I mean they'll be blown all out of proportion. The drums will be beaten. The companies involved with them will go through the roof in the stock market. And at a key moment, the creators of the bubble will retrieve their profits, and the rest of you can whistle Dixie in the poorhouse. So we have a bubbleocracy here. Now in school you're allowed to study the South Seas bubble of the 18th century, was it? And a few other bubbles. But we are the world masters in bubbleocracy. Hasn't stopped just because 7,000 people in the country, 7 million, have been thrown out of their homes because they couldn't meet the mortgage payments. And another 5 million are pending government charity, which may or may not be forthcoming. So you would have known these things if your schools had allowed you to carefully study Machiavelli, who became the advisor to all big-time governments 4 centuries ago. What he taught was the tactical use of illusion in the art of managing ordinary people. The existing rituals between childhood and adulthood don't work at all anymore. We need to think the rules again from scratch. And by we, I mean ordinary citizens, because for a long time now, our leadership in both parties hasn't any idea how to keep us together as a nation, or even much interest in doing so. Read the tea leaves. That's what cheating on medical care, sending people to die in meaningless wars, and dumbing the young down through schooling means. They don't care. We once had a model of educational schooling, let me call it, which produced such artifacts that dazzled the world. It's the fact that up to 1939, we had 90% of all the patents granted on planet Earth. 90%. Today it's 22%, dropping steeply. I don't have the slightest doubt it'll be 5% 20 years from now, because no one has the power on top to reverse this progress. It would, I have to be sarcastic when I say progress, because it would disadvantage too many powerful people. So by now this pernicious school identity, which is the rigid procedures of Prussian schooling imported into the United States, has shut our national imagination down. That's why 35% of the tech firms in Silicon Valley are created by foreign nationals, and the patents, as I just told you. A fellow who writes for the New York Times wrote on February the 22nd of last year about this disintegration. He didn't call it incoherence, but he said, all we have left as a nation, I'm quoting now, is football, March Madness, Dancing with the Stars, and a recognition, quote, that half of us hate the other half. If you listen to talk radio, you'll know what he means. The American economy and social order have been managed for over a century now by employing external disciplines intended to convert the young from independent, sovereign spirits with active imaginations, spirits which generate innovation and self-sufficiency, convert them into human resources who do as they are told to do and buy what they are told to buy. In a well-regulated corporate society, this is utterly necessary. I mean, these machines are expensive to buy and maintain. Nobody can speculate setting them up. Your client base has to be guaranteed. Schools are the guarantor. Corporate America has accomplished what only the great evangelical religions of history did, homogenizing men, women, and children into a collective humanoid slurry, which lives mainly to endlessly consume and to seek out pleasant sensations. This is life on its lowest genital level. Structured schooling, the principal tool of this conversion, although the churches have played a big hand in this, and so have the Army and every other American institution, the courts, the prisons, you name it. And corporate America has created a religion, the point of which is unlike any other religion in history. All of those were meant to have you repudiate the material order and rise above it. This one asks you to repudiate any hope that there is anything higher and to wallow in the material part of living. Pleasure and pain, pain and pleasure. Corporate America has changed the American dream through propaganda and through forced institutional schooling into doing as little as possible. That's a big part of our dream. Eating as much as possible, self-indulging in every other way as much as possible, and actually living vicariously through the performance of actors pretending to be real people. The fatness of America, a condition in which bodies lose their structural and aesthetic integrity, is the perfect metaphor for the incoherence of American national life. It says here, stop. What could that mean? Wait. It can't mean stop, I know, because I sat back there. Okay. It's not a stop. It's a stop and a continuation with the beginning of part 2, that actually is the end of part 1, called The German Disease. Subtitle, Everything You Know About Schooling is Wrong. Even if you only listen with one ear to School Matters, you will have figured out by now that the goal of school reform in America resides in raising standardized test scores, presumably as a proxy for measuring learning. But if you look harder, and there's a ton of information that's collected on this over the past century, you will discover that hardly a scrap of evidence exists to support that conjecture, that tests measure, some intellectual power. The implied connection has never been shown to exist. The only correlation that ever has been shown to exist reliably when it continues from test to test is standardized tests predict almost perfectly what your grade on the next standardized test is going to be. Nevertheless, school reform in America is about raising standardized test scores. Nobody ever dares to ask why. Why should we spend $50 billion a year raising these scores when not a single person in this room, and I don't know any of you, has ever used the results of those tests on any significant decision you ever made? When you go to the beauty parlor, you don't say, I would really like to see your standardized test scores. When you go to the doctor, you say, I want the surgeon with the highest standardized test score. No one ever uses the information. American business does not use the information. They don't even use the older version of measuring quality, the grade point average, the famous GPA. I spent an hour with the admissions director of Harvard University and an hour with the admissions director of Princeton University. And the Harvard lady told me, we only accept people in Harvard who have demonstrated a record of excellence. I said, you mean perfect SAT score? No, she said. Those are not evidence of anything at all. You have to have created a charity, walked across the United States, been the first woman to sail alone around the world, all kinds of ways to show excellence before you apply with your bag full of commendations and standardized test scores. They don't even look at them. The Princeton fellow was much more elegant than the Harvard lady. And when I asked him what he uses in lieu of standardized test scores to admit people to Princeton, last year Princeton turned down 4,000 applicants who had a perfect SAT score and a perfect grade point average. Harvard only turned down a couple thousand. Stanford turned down 3,000. Caltech turned... Why doesn't anyone tell you this? There must be a reason. The information is in the public record, but someone has to say, why don't you look? Anyway, the Princeton guy, I said, what do you do in lieu of it? He said, well, of all the items on a resume, we look first at, if you lived 1 million years, you would not be able to fill in the blank. At hobbies, my jaw dropped open. I've been taught all my life to leave that off. If there isn't room for it, leave it off your resume. On the contrary, he said, it's the only accurate information you can get out of a young person. Everything else has been, dickered around with, and experts have intervened, and the testing services have sold you advice. But hobbies, he said, is a young person telling you what they do with their time when they have a free choice. And he said, it's unmistakably reliable. It's a window right into the mind and the heart. Well, what hobbies, I said? Baseball, football for guys? Oh, he said, we have a prejudice against team sports. I said, no, wait, I've been taught all my life that they show you can cooperate. He said, what they show is, for a slick operator, is you can always dog it and hide behind your teammates on both sides of the line, and so on, he said. So he said, now, solo sports, we place at the very pinnacle of measuring human excellence. Solo sports, but there's one condition. They have to be the type that threatens your life if you don't do them correctly. For example, trail riding on a full-blooded horse with low-lying branches, you can conclude your ride without a head. You don't have to go to Mexico to have them take it off. You know, the branch will take it off. Or sailing these little one-person sailboats, what are they, lightnings? There's probably a bunch of names for them. Out of sight of land. Because when you're out of sight of land, there aren't any bearings you can take. You can end up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific in a hurricane if you don't know what you're doing out of sight of land. So it's no more fun in games. And I said, well, what was the most striking solo sport that you ever admitted a student on the basis of? Well, he said, head and shoulders above all the rest, was a fellow who invented a way to compete with himself. So he kept historical records of his performance and then tried to exceed them. It was seatless unicycle riding over broken terrain. If I lived 1,000 years, I couldn't make that up. I did pretty good that time. My leg's broken. The funny thing is, and I'll bet you it's happening with some of you in the audience right now, I had no prior warning of this kind of criteria for admission to elite colleges. But the instant these people said that, I didn't have to reflect on it. It had the sound of divine truth. Why on earth would you judge people on the basis of stuff they memorized and then retrieved? Why? Wouldn't you ask them, and of course I'm ruining for future parts, wouldn't you ask them to show application? Isn't the way everyone in this room judges people, and you do it every day, if you can get the data by performance? You can't lie with performance. When the Steelers and the Packers are out there Sunday, there isn't any way to look to the records or the history. You have to smash somebody until he won't get up. Hopefully it'll be the quarterback of Green Bay, but I did grow up in Pittsburgh. You can't lie about performance. Sometimes for a very short time, you can put on an artificial personality, as people do all the time on these social networking sites, and you can fool people for a little while, but it's impossible to sustain the deception. You know, if you're a stingy person and the lady you want to go out with despises anyone who isn't generous, you can pretend to be generous, but under her scrutiny for a few days, she will figure out that you're as cheap as they make them and wash her hands of you. You can't conceal performance. It's an indelible record of truth. When kids used to come to me, or adults, moaning, complaining about what somebody said, I said, Aristotle, that's 1,000, 2,000, 2,300 years ago, taught his students to absolutely disregard what anybody says. He said, look at what they do. They can't lie about it. Look at what they do. That became a big part of my own teaching of 13-year-olds. If you just give me a minute to reconnect with the scrawls on this piece of paper. Okay, so the standardized testing urgency now consumes 10% of American classroom time on average, and it's supplanted the earlier urgency. urgency to get high grades, even though among ordinary people, grades still linger in our culture as proper measures of learning, and they're still honored in politically incorrect customs, such as the honor roll, which of course the utility of the honor roll is to tell the losers that they are losers, they'll never be anything else but losers, and they may as well quit. That is actually the psychological reasoning behind posting the honor roll. I don't say any school teacher knows that. And the administrator comes by and said, where are the excellent papers not posted? But he doesn't know anything about it either. That's the order that came with his manual of practice. So the trouble with the grades, which everybody sooner or later realizes, is the wide variation in local schools makes grades meaningless. Some people, out of philosophical principle, give everybody an A. And some people, out of philosophical principle, don't give anyone an A. Of course, the scuttlebutt the kids circulate eventually creates a crude guide to who does what, but that helps you not at all in public school. It can help you in college. My fraternity, Delta Dot Delta, are there any delts in here at Cornell, told me not to worry about exams because they had a book of all the tests a particular professor has given for the last 10 years. I said, but what if he transfers from like University of, oh, we have that too. There's a Delt chapter down there. We have, what is the library called? Interlibrary loans over there. He said, so you got to concentrate on important things like drinking and all the rest of that good stuff. We don't look kindly on people who study here. Of course, that's an elite university. Now, the more common the school gets, the more they still retain a sentimental attachment to how hard somebody works. But aren't we all attempting to send our children to these elite schools? You bet. And do they commit suicide when they don't get in? You bet. All right, so grades were dismissed years ago. That fact has been kept from ordinary parents, almost totally so from poor parents. After all, how would it even be possible to discipline a crowd of young strangers if we didn't have the threat of grades and future jobs to hold over their heads? If grades don't actually mean much, schools would be lost. The shift to standardized test score, thought by a lot of teachers and lay people alike to be somehow fairer, is based on a belief that stems from faith, a faith nearly as profound as that needed to accept the concept of virgin birth, which I, as a Roman Catholic altar board, do accept. But it does take faith. It's not very many bits of data that would actually testify to that happening. So nobody's actually spent time and money trying to establish productive correlations between test scores and useful competency, or test scores and success in later life, has actually come up with anything. The Chinese government has hired me over the past 3 years 6 times. I have to sign the same contract I sign when I speak at Apple Computer, that I will tell nobody that I'm working for Apple or the Chinese government, and that if I do, whatever I'm paid is forfeit, and they will deny that I'm telling the truth. And you can see that my Machiavellian side my Italian half. So of course I'll do that. Anyway, what am I hired for? Because with the tremendous power, productivity, cash reserves of modern China, the people at the top, the managers, are aware that without massive theft of patents and copyrights, the death spiral would occur. They get wonderfully reliable, very brilliantly intelligent people, much more reliable than Americans, but they've been trained not to initiate ideas. And at some point, China's aware that as it enters the Council of Nations, that stealing patents and copyrights will carry a heavy price. They would rather have their own citizenry create these things. And every time I'm hired, I go over there, I say the same thing. As long as you produce Prussian schooling, and they do it better than the Prussians ever did, you can kiss the imagination goodbye. Prussian schooling is habit training and attitude training. And the imagination won't sit still for that. So you can see our progress in Prussian schooling measured by the decline in patents from 1939 to today. The steep decline in patents, which is continuing. As we teach, what do they call, basic skills, as we enlarge the testing domain, our own students become less and less imaginative. So we find ourselves right now in one of the great dilemmas of history. The Chinese, the Indians, the Malaysians can do Prussian schooling much better than we can because we have to deal with traditions of liberty and freedom and individuality that came right back, with the boats that landed the people in the 17th century. And we keep those traditions alive in rhetoric, even when in law and schooling we put them to death. So we're starting out with 2.5 strikes against us if we want to compete with China or India or Malaysia in Prussian schooling, because their traditions allow the mass of the population to be kept subordinate, and ours don't. Our practices do, but our traditions don't. So there you see. Watch the Super Bowl, root for Pittsburgh. So you're going to get your break in, looks like 4 or 5 minutes. 100 well-funded academic attempts, some of them enormously expensive, to discover meaningful test correlations have failed to show any which justify the king's ransom in cost that these things bleed from the productive economy. These repeated failures to justify the value of testing have been kept utterly from the public. This is unknown to the public, and woe betide the insider who begins to talk, why are we doing this? Not only has academic social science failed in establishing a correlation, but there is the embarrassing anomaly that America's prominent politicians, I'll bet you a penny on the side that in the next 5 minutes, if you're shockable, that I'm going to shock you. So there's the embarrassing anomaly that America's most famous and prominent politicians, presidents of the stature of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or John Fitzgerald Kennedy, senators of the stature of Paul Wellstone or Bill Bradley, mayors of major cities, and many more people in the public eye whose records can usually be Googled, seem to be almost to a person distinctly mediocre, both at standardized assessments and at grade point averages. I'll give you a little bit of a way to test my credibility. Franklin Roosevelt was a C student in secondary school and a C student at college. He's the only one of this list who actually boasted in a document that he was a C student. George W. Bush, that won't surprise you, was a C student in secondary school and a C student in college. But what might surprise you is the man he beat for the presidency, Kerry of Massachusetts, was a lower C student than Bush in secondary school and a lower C student than Bush at Yale. Of course, they were fraternity brothers at Yale. That's something that's considered bad manners to talk about. They were good friends. What are the mathematical chances that out of 308 million people, two fraternity brothers from Yale University in the same years, both C students, would run against one another for president? That might give you a little bit of insight into the reality behind the 4th of July speeches. John F. Kennedy was a C student in secondary school, and you bet, a C student in college. Indeed, many tycoons of business, like Ted Turner of CNN and Ingvar Kamprad of IKEA, Warren Avis, who gave us airport car rentals, either didn't bother with college at all or attended for a very, very short time, then dropped out, never to return. If I'm ever on a panel with Bill Gates, I want to ask him without a tone in my voice, what do you think you missed by not having the college experience and a degree? I know you have $60 billion. I know your home has 18,000 square feet. In the latest home, I don't know how his other homes are sized, but I would imagine on that. Now here, I hope is what's going to shock you. That, in a moment. That goes for the high-tech world. It includes Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Michael Dell, all men without degrees. Dell said it's a waste of time. He took one course. Like the seismic shift from grades to standardized test scores and the inability of standardized test scores to predict much of anything, the absence of college degrees among men who can be said to have made the modern world is only allowed to be whispered about and never, never whispered about in schools. In fact, there it isn't mentioned at all. I personally, this ought to shock you if you have any shockability. I personally did mention it once. This, of course, would be another time. I was speaking to the graduating seniors at Highland High School in Hudson, New York, about 40 miles north of New York City on the Hudson, an extremely wealthy community, where if you overhear the student conversations, it's mocking the common automobiles that the faculty of the high school drive. It's just filled with BMWs and Mercedes. It's the high school parking lot, sports cars. I was invited to speak to the senior graduating classes. And not meaning any mischief at all, I sat down with my Scottish Presbyterian wife, and I said, I don't want to waste their time. Their attention span will be small enough as it is because they've already had the grades in. And I want to be able to do something useful for them. And she said, why don't you try to dispel the anxiety and the nervousness that comes from waiting for the thin envelope or the fat envelope. I hope you all understand that slang. If you get a thin envelope, you don't have to open it. It's I regret to tell you. If you get the fat envelope, that's the good thing. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And what I just said to you, a bit more elaborate, I was saying to this wealthy audience at Highland High School, strike me dead, Lord, if I exaggerate a bit, when the doors of the auditorium burst open. They didn't open. It made that noise that everybody looks. 3 cops came in with megaphones. They ordered the classes back to class immediately. Chop, chop, let's get going. Then they came up front to where I was. I thought the building was on fire or something. You know, you'd never be allowed to escape a school if the building were burning. You have to go to your teacher, and she would lead you out of the building. Otherwise, you'd be punished. So they came up and they told me if I didn't leave the school immediately, I would be arrested. Now, if you try to say, how did this happen to me? I was wearing a suit and a tie. I was being very polite, and I was laying down data that's documentable, not really drawing any conclusions from it otherwise than a whole lot of this fear factor is misplaced. You know, these names are legion. I just gave you a few of them. That was so intolerable to the building principal and to the teachers, who of course used threats to keep the kids in line. They called the superintendent. The superintendent called the local police. And 20 minutes after I'd said this, in the United States of America, and not in a ghetto, I was being threatened with arrest if I didn't leave immediately. There was no more in my head that was going to be transmitted to those kids, because they'd talk to their younger brothers and sisters. It would spread from school to school like a cancer. How can you school kids like Fisher schooled so that every fin moves simultaneously if they actually think that your threats are hollow? Well, they learned a lesson there, that even listening to talk like that was worthy of summoning the police. That story, by the way, with more detail, is in Weapons of Mass. I've only brought 5 copies. But if you want a copy, you can go to my website, www.johntaylorgatto.com, and you can get one there. There are 4 copies left of Dumbing Us Down, which Harvard last year, the JFK School of Government, gave me credit for introducing the term globally. With that book, and then by constantly speaking all over the world, you're my 3.5 millionth mile I've traveled since I quit teaching on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, saying I was no longer willing to hurt children. And you realize that good teachers hurt children much worse than bad teachers do, because good teachers are the reason the institution stays alive, and the kids transfer credibility to them. So the lies good teachers tell are actually believed. I wrote a letter. My daughter at MIT was praising a professor, and I said, here's my experience. with good teachers. They do much more damage than the people you are disrespectful to. Anyway, what I just told you sounds like a lurid fantasy, but it did happen. One lovely way to settle the matter of how much value school assessments actually have is to examine your own life and tease out the times, I said this earlier, but to tease out the times that you've actually used this expensively gathered data in making any decision at all. Who to cut your hair, who to mow your grass, who to let your daughter marry. You don't even think of asking for it because the commonsensical spirit in you knows that it's worthless information, even worse than it's misleading because it makes ordinary people seem to be outstanding and vice versa. Here's another handy way to make up your own mind as to the value of school assessment. Imagine a world, this is not rhetorical, I literally would ask you to do this. Imagine a world in which every single student got perfect standardized test scores and perfect grade point averages. You already know that about 20,000 people a year do get them. What if 10 million people a year got them? So my real question is, how would the world change if that happened? Would there be more scientific discoveries? Would the quotient of human happiness, or stable marriages, or longevity, would it rise dramatically? What exactly would happen? Because something big would happen if everyone taught at the top of the ladder. The people who currently reach the top of the ladder feel tremendously entitled. They've sacrificed a normal life in order to specialize in cracking these test codes. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta said to me 10 years ago that the most coherent body in their records that commits suicide wholesale are the kids who win national merit scholarships. That entitles you to 4 years, all expenses, full tuition at any college in the country you would like to attend. And more than any other group in the country, they commit suicide. If you were asked to figure out why, I think using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is, having enjoyed privileges through the unreal world of schooling, by getting these high grades, they're projected into a world that doesn't care at all what grades you got. It cares that you can show what you can do or have done. Like the Harvard lady, having high SAT scores doesn't show anything at all. And after they butt their heads against the wall for some time, a fraction of them say, life's not worth living. These are the top producers in the academic sweepstakes. Perhaps that would shock you a little too. But now you're equipped to understand why Harvard turns down 8 out of every 10 valedictorians who apply for admission. It's easy to figure this out when you have the Rosetta Stone I just gave you. And now you actually get a 12-minute break. Okay. The conclusion's much shorter. It'll be about a half an hour, 35 minutes. In case you have a desperate need to own a hardcover copy of the first edition of Dummy Stand. There happened to be 4 of them over there.
Let's go ahead.
When we left, we were talking about the possible relationship of national incoherence as expressed through cheating the American medicine buyer, cheating the American parent who consigns their son or daughter to an institutional school, and a number of other things. And now part 2 has a title that's going to explain where this particular philosophy came from that allowed people in good conscience to do this. Part 2 is called The German Disease. In the early 19th century, a small but very important nation in the Germanies, as the fragmented forerunner of the modern German state was called, I think there were 167 little countries, staked its well-being on a system of universal forced schooling. This little Germany among all the other Germanies had the name of Prussia. And the name has preserved itself wonderfully through history 130 years after its national existence was terminated, or seemed to be terminated. In actual fact, Prussia swallowed up all the other 166 Germanies, plus sections of Poland and all the rest of its neighbors, and its effective schooling was studied in the next 2 decades all over the world. Delegations from Japan and Russia and Brazil, and a delegation from the United States under the direction of Horace Mann. That's a 2N man at the end. It came. Horace was compelled to lie in a famous letter to the Boston School Committee as he described what he had seen in Prussia. Your local librarian will easily be able to obtain it for you, and I would guess that it'll already be in your local library as it is all over the country. It's the 7th letter to the Boston School Committee, and Horace describes such a utopia created by Prussian schooling that we must have it in the state of Massachusetts. Now, unbeknownst to the readers of that letter, Horace didn't get to Prussia while the schools were open because he was so dazzled by spending other people's money looking at France and England and all the wonders that when he got to Prussia, the schools were closed. But you could hardly expect him to then go back and say, hey, I blew it, God. Could I have another stipend? So he went back and he wrote this glowing imperative to the Boston School Committee, 100% of which was Unitarians, as was 99% of all the state officials in the state of Massachusetts. They were 1% of the population, but they were all of the governance. And the rise of Unitarian, I'm not saying this is a religious critique, the rise of Unitarianism is closely connected with Germany, or the Germanies. In fact, there's a famous heresy named after it. Is it Society? Say again? Socianism, I think. My wife's writing a book called Fat Saint's Cookbook, in which every recipe is based on an overweight saint. And then there's a follow-up book called the Heretics Cookbook, in which the recipe is created for each of the various heresies, which there are more than you could possibly understand. They're all stored in a vault at the Vatican. Okay, so I'm referring to Prussia. Prussia is the model for institutionalized schooling that we follow today. And since Prussia made a conscious effort to recreate ancient Sparta and the Spartan method of schooling in its society, we should consider ourselves the stepchildren of both. Prussia plus Sparta equals school bells. That's the equation. Prussian, wait a second. You see, I added a piece up here, just in the back of the room. In Prussian schooling, children exist to be employed by the political state as human resources. That is the purpose of Prussian schooling. And not until 10 years ago did I hear this German compound, which translates as human resources, suddenly appear all around me in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Now, I can quickly solve some of that mystery for you if you will obtain an uncut version of Hitler's Mein Kampf. You will find a testimonial of high praise to the most Germanic people on earth, the Americans. Hitler had a 10-foot portrait of Henry Ford behind his desk for Ford's wonderful work in marginalizing the Jews. I'm sure you're all aware of that, right? If not, ask your librarian to get an inter-system loan for copies of a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, published by Henry Ford, which doesn't have anything else in it except denunciations of Jews. So that's the Henry Ford you have not been allowed to hear about, I think. Nor have you been allowed to hear about the Rockefeller family, denounced in 1943 from the floor of the U.S. Senate by a haberdasher from Missouri called Harry S. Truman. And what was Truman denouncing the Rockefellers for? He said, they are supplying the German army with the fuel they need to operate their military vehicles. They have 100 dummy corporations. And Exxon or Esso, it was called then, sells to one of these, sells to another. The trail becomes impossible to follow. But the oil ends up in Germany, and that was 1943, when the war was hardly reaching its conclusion. So, you might also like to know that we would not have institutional American schooling without the Rockefeller family, and Andrew Carnegie, and probably a handful of less important moguls. Rockefeller published an inside newsletter that said the point of this schooling, which he admitted was German schooling in poor. You remember Rockefeller set up University of Chicago to follow the German university system. It was a little fifth-rate institute before Rockefeller converted it, set up Johns Hopkins to reverse the priority of faculty and students in the school. The faculty was no longer to serve the students, the exact reverse. If the students worked himself to death, the faculty would trade through their corporate connections, important positions in later life or graduate school admissions, regardless of what your grades were. That was the Hopkins modification of the German university system, perfected at the University of Berlin in Prussia, in which no longer were universities about education. They were about service to the political state and to the owners of the economy. Is this a radical speaking? No, the idea was written down by a British nobleman named Francis Bacon, and you can access Bacon's writings in every library in the United States. Bacon in a fragment, maybe the rest of it exists, that you're not allowed to see, in a fragment called The New Atlantis, sets up the university system in which probably most of you have been a part of. It does not exist for your personal profit or development. It exists to provide human resources to the leaders of the political state and the economy, and nothing has changed over the centuries with one big exception. They've learned, because the class system hasn't collapsed, but it's been truncated, they have learned not to speak openly about this. They speak in code. And if you got a book by President Clinton's personal tutor at Georgetown called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, the code would be revealed to you in 1,400 brilliantly written pages. Macmillan, the publisher, had 10,000 orders for a second edition in hand when it broke the plates, so the book couldn't be reprinted. Got printed in the first place because Carroll Quigley was a prestigious academic, and probably nobody actually read the text. You know, they were just going to make some brownie points with Georgetown, which after all is one of the movers and shakers in the country. And what Quigley wrote, as the only man ever allowed access to the private library of the Council on Foreign Relations, was how the world actually works, not as opinion, chapter, verse, names, strategies. 1,400 pages, he gave away the store. Well, Macmillan would have had to take some responsibility for allowing that information to get out. They broke the plates, and they told Quigley there were no orders, and so it had gone out of business. I got my copy through a dentist who bootlegged the book in Santa Clara, California. He heard I was looking for it. It's been stripped from all the libraries in the country. I travel often enough to say that definitively. It's been stolen. I'm sorry, it's just not there. The 10th time I asked for it, it probably was stolen. Flew to Dallas the next week, wasn't there. San Francisco wasn't there. Chicago wasn't there. Wow, it was gone. So I stole the book, but I had to return it from the rare book room at New York University. One of my spies said there's a copy here. But I wanted to own the text so I could refer to it. I got a call in the middle of the night from a dentist in Santa Cruz who said, I heard you're looking for the Quigley book. Now, if you think that's creepy, remember my lecture at a high school was shut down when I revealed the standardized test score. Hey, well, anyway, he said, I can sell you a copy for $50. And I'll express it to you for another 10 or 15. So I actually own one of the copies. I have heard through the grapevine that the book was reprinted about a year ago, but I would caution you to get one of the bootleg copies, because no major publisher wouldn't screen that text and remove key data from it. Buy one of the bootleg copies. There are about 6 bootleggers now in the country. And anything you've ever heard about international conspiracies, anything. Who's the television evangelist who talks about global conspiracy? He's a huge name. He makes $100 million a year, probably a month there. I was able, when the New York Times denounced him, to see that nothing they denounced him for could have come from anywhere else than the Quigley book. And I notified the Times in a very carefully worded letter that they really were denouncing the head of the International Affairs Department at Georgetown University, because he was the source of all this information. And even though I've had 11 letters published in the Times, including one last week, they demurred at publishing that one. It was easier to condemn this television evangelist as a conspiracy now. Well, you can see that the next time I'm here, it'll just be all admin. So back to Prussia. Prussian military, economic, and political success succeeded in bringing about the reunification of Germany during the 1870s under the so-called Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Tough man. He made the pointy hats, spear on the top. That was an accomplishment so impressive, because it had been tried for hundreds of years to put this creature back together. It drew observers from all over the world, intent on studying how this wonderful event had been pulled off. Prussia also drew students from all over the world by creating, Prussia, Hanover, and Saxony, creating an imaginary degree that only existed in utopian literature to anoint a select few with the management of society. That was the PhD degree, which did not exist. And suddenly, if you wanted one of these things, there was no other game in town. You picked up and went to Prussia or Saxony or Hanover. Now those are particularly interesting former small countries in United Germany. Hanover is the source of the entire British royal family. They're Hanoverian Germans, and Saxony was the home of Martin Luther, who ordered the clocks to be set to strike every 15 minutes so that time would not be wasted. You will not waste time in Saxony. These 3 countries, Prussia being the most important of the 3, created the PhD degree. And suddenly, every important family in the United States who wanted a position of authority had to go to Prussia and obtain this degree. Every president of every college, except Cornell, of every major college, was a Prussian PhD holder. Every department head in Washington, D.C. was a Prussian PhD holder. There was one exception allowed. If you were a student of someone who came back from Prussia with a PhD, you could be let in under an exception rule. That was John Dewey, the father of American schooling, who studied under G. Stanley Hall, who was the head of the psych department at Johns Hopkins, and that allowed Dewey to be considered as part of the secret fraternity that now was taking over the levers of power all over the United States. I wish that your junior high schools had let you in on these facts, every one of which is eminently documentable. You don't have to search in the dusty stack, but if you don't know this happened, why would you ever look? You see what I mean? So the Prussianization of America took place before the internet, and you now know the mechanism through which it was transmitted. You couldn't get a promotion at a university unless you either had the PhD degree or you agreed to Prussianize yourself rather circumspectly, so you didn't go around bellowing. The Chautauqua movement, which many people consider one of the flowerings of the American libertarian intellect, was in fact a development of exactly this movement, because it was considered in policy circles, if seemingly everything was open to be studied by anybody at all in these 10 Chautauquas that moved around, any particular motive for digging deeper and finding the actual reality would be dissipated. The Harper family, who created Harper Publishers, were the leading actors in that particular draw. Furthermore, if I, as a policymaker, wish to infect your minds with a new idea that would shake society to its foundations, you would be treated to a Chautauqua with all the tricks available to show business to demonstrate how wonderful a thing it would be if all the children in the nation were drained out of their homes and their farms and their villages and their towns, and of course their cities, and drawn like Pied Piper into a cave called schooling, not called education. You got to admit that the intellectual upper classes are nothing if not legalistic. They don't want to be accused of hiding things from you. And since the only other use of that term is with fish, who swim in schools in an amazing unison, might you not think from this phenomenon being called schooling that something similar to training the school of fish was its intention? Anyway, don't let me add it one more time. This is the short half. So we can talk back and forth. So for all practical purposes, Prussia created universal force schooling. The idea had been around for thousands of years. I mean, you can find it clearly in Plato. You can find it clearly in Charlemagne and his educational guy, whose name I can't pronounce. Alcuin. In Alcuin's writing, you'll find what's in Plato's writing. And in John Calvin's writing, Institutes of the Christian Religion, you will find almost whole sections lifted from Plato and Alcuin. And then if you move up to the liberal philosopher, that's in quotation marks, Spinoza in Holland, in 1690 publishes a book saying that almost all of you are permanently deranged. You're insane. You're murderously insane. And the only way to defuse your insanity, he's not writing for the public, he's writing for the kings and princes of Europe and the United States, is to set up a system of universal compulsion schooling. And chapter 2, infect the minds of the students with half-truths and a whole lot of nonsense so they can't think clearly, so they can't get in your way later on if you're one of the handful of sane people. And you find the identical theme in Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. All this stuff about evolution, no evolution, is a smokescreen to keep you from asking, well, what else did this fellow Darwin, one of the wealthiest men in the world, you won't hear that from your textbook either, what else did this fellow do that might help me understand him? And one of the things he did in 1871 was to write a book, which will be in every library in your state and every other state, called The Descent of Man, in which he says clearly that the progress of the human race depends on securing breeding access to the prettiest, healthiest women. There aren't enough of them to go around, he said. And so what happens is that the small fragment of the population who are actually evolving and require, Congress with one of these ladies, now have to compete with some drunken Irishman, or some bestial Italian. He really comes close to that language. 90% of the human race to Darwin, I think more than that, is permanently biologically inferior. And what that means politically is unless the good stuff that is evolving can be separated from the bad stuff, evolution will march backwards into the swirling mists of the dawnless past and re-enter the swamp. It's pretty, There's a rich guy telling you this, and already his first book is made him the most famous scientific figure on Earth, even though he clearly states in the first 15 pages of Evolution of Species that everything important he's saying was discovered hundreds of years ago by plant and animal breeders. And that he's simply scientizing, the trip around the world. Of course it happened. Didn't need to happen. It had already, the data had been provided. So, here comes a national movement still underway to sort out the evolutionary trash. Remember, that's 90% of the population from the good stuff. And there's about 16 ways that it's done. At Harvard, for example, which earlier was one of the primary dividers, after politically trashy people forced their way into Harvard, it could only be done by admission to selective courses at Harvard. The seminars by permission of the professor only. That's what they're for. They're for evolutionary advancement. Country clubs. Suddenly, it was a phenomenon that hardly existed in the United States. 10 years after Darwin's Descent of Man, there were thousands of them, because you could then exclude the breeding stock that wasn't suitable for providing your grandchildren from joining the country club. And we all know that if you just put two people together long enough, they're going to find an attraction between them. It just works that way. There's some exceptions, but there are more non-exceptions than not. That's why your mother told you You're known by the company you keep, or you are what you eat. This is the populist echoing of Mr. Darwin's scientific thunder. So, what I've just given you is the reason why schooling cannot be educational. From Plato, through Charlemagne, through John Calvin, through Spinoza, and right through Mr. Darwin to the great psychophysicists of Germany, like Wilhelm Wundt. There was a uniform belief spanning centuries that the word education itself was nonsense, since most of the population, whether you analyze them biologically or philosophically or psychologically or any other way, were incapable of learning. So what they had to do was be propagandized, their habits and their attitudes trained, and the mechanism of training that worked best was to dangle prizes and then set them at each other's throat. In Julius Caesar's famous discovery that a small army can whip an enormous army as long as the enormous army isn't on the same page. Well, the competition beginning in kindergarten is about making sure that you're not on the same page with your natural allies that you have common interests with. Well, you only if that's going to cost you a chance at the honor roll or the pizza party or the scholarship to, it's life and death, isn't it? Every day, little tests and little informal tests where you grant privilege by the teacher smiling at you in front of the class and saying, wonderful answer, and another person gets. Do you always have to be a smart aleck? That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Sometimes I depress myself talking about it, but other times it makes me angry enough that it's 75. Here I am pounding on the table. So Prussia created this kind of schooling expressly to convert sovereign spirits into human resources. And guess who one of the very first nations to swallow this bait hook, line, and sinker was? It was the nation of Japan, humiliated by its defeats at the hands of Europeans. They weren't going to stand for that much longer. Not only did they import Prussian schooling into the country, they rewrote the Constitution under the Meiji Restoration. I probably didn't pronounce that right. 1868. It was the Prussian Constitution translated into Japanese. Russia wasn't fighting Japan in World War I. They were fighting Prussia, and we weren't fighting Japan in World War II. We were fighting Prussia. Now, here's the kicker in that equation. By far the largest line of descent in the American population, I'm part of it, is a descent from the Germanys. About 51% of our population can trace an ancestor or all their ancestors back to immigration from the Germanys. So in a funny way, as Hitler says in Mein Kampf, they have accepted the mantle of leadership which the Pope conferred on us in the Fifth Crusade. I never heard of the Fifth Crusade. Well, that's not accidental either. There were 5 crusades. The 5th one involved a military organization known as the Teutonic Knights. The Pope ordered them to the North Sea to exterminate the heathen Prus. That's why it's called Prussia. So Prussia was, as Israel is today, it was a theocracy. It looked like another country, but the principles it was operating on at bottom weren't debatable at all, because they had the truth. And they were going to teach their neighbors that truth. Forget the fact that they had no natural resources, that their population wasn't nearly large enough to attack Russia, let alone all of Europe and the United States. It's a secular religion. You will learn German manners. My friend's landlord said when he evacuated his apartment in Berlin 3 hours late, and the landlord came home, saw that he was still there, looked at his watch and said, "You will learn German manners," and proceeded to break my friend's nose. He said, "I flew across the room about 20 yards, and then he wasn't satisfied." Because the law had been violated, and when you replace principles or morality with law, you're in a lot of hot water. Anyway, don't let me add that one more time. But I hope you see that these narratives are part of the whole I'm trying to spin. So, New England, under a New England disposition, because they were slightly Prussianized, but they didn't require more than 2 hours schooling a day, and never more than 3 months a year, and usually it was more like 2 months or a month and a half. So under a New England disposition of occasional schooling, even with the horrible rocky soils of the region and its inclement weathers, the whole population of New England began to thrive. It created an explosion of profitable, innovative businesses, some so miraculous that I hesitate to share them with you, because surely you'll say he's made them up. One big business that was up and running by 1805, it's 206 years ago, was to cut ice out of New England ponds, pack it in sawdust, sail it over to India, and sell it to the elite classes in India. Now, you would think they have the Himalayas not all that far away, but in fact, it was a wonderful business that produced capital for many other businesses to rise out of. So, let the ice serve as a dramatic symbol of what the lightly schooled can do with their imagination. And we are in such a desperate state economically now. It's the only way I can see out. China hired me secretly, made me sign a pledge of silence, because they're wonderful students, and they are wonderful, and they're a wonderfully productive country. And it would depress you to see that there's still a hole in the ground in New York from 9/11, but you watch on every block of Shanghai or Guangzhou or Xi'an, huge machinery. I mean, on every block, they must have almost all of it in the world, just ripping things down. And the highway system that took Eisenhower a decade to build, they will have in place before they have cars enough to drive on the highways. And so it's amazing, but they draw heavily on stolen ideas, and they don't credit those ideas. They don't pay royalties or fees. And they know, because they, after all, they've been thinking for 5,000 years. That's why their cuisine is untouchable by any other cuisine in the world. They know that there's a short fuse on how long you can live on other people's intellectual property. So they want to know how they can have their cake and eat it too. Impose this maniacally Prussian schooling on their population at the same time, force them to innovate and create. Well, it can't. And every time I say that, and I say it respectfully because I have such admiration for what the Chinese have done with no help at all from other than soul. Let me sit for 6 months and then they hire me back. I sit with ministers, I sign a contract of silence, and essentially they want to know the same thing. Where are we going to get these innovative people? And I say, listen, I'm sorry to tell you this, but it won't happen. It is not a pill you take. You have to be free to make new connections, to see the world in new ways, and about 10 other qualities. And those qualities are so politically disruptive, if you encourage them, that you wouldn't like what would happen if you got the innovative population you want. I said, the Chinese who come to the United States don't have, as a school teacher, I saw this, and my wife wouldn't believe it. I'd say there'd be a Chinese immigrant family drop a student in my class, and I'd run into the person 3 years later, and so help me God, they spoke better English than I did. They were thoroughly more American than I was. So they have this wonderfully intense way of studying something they wish to be and doing it better than the original. I mean, it really is marvelous. And yet, I'm in Guangzhou, Canton, to those of you who are old-fashioned. And I'm desperate to get a cup of tea because there's coffee all over the place. And these fast food restaurants, McDonald's, and every franchise you ever heard of, and some you haven't, they're on like every block there. So finally someone told me that on the Pearl River there was a traditional tea parlor. So I get down this steep hill from my hotel, which, by the way, has American traveling entertainment acts and a big billboard for American movies on the side. I get down to the tea house. I go in, and there really are upwards of 1,000 people sitting at tables with tea. So the menu has 500 kinds of tea on it. I'm really in seventh heaven. Not that I'm a tea drinker, but I'm in China. I don't want coffee. So I pick a couple of teas, and I have them serially. And as the warm glow settles in, I become aware that nobody is speaking in the tea house, and that all of their heads are inclined up at, what is this, a 30-degree angle? It really was creepy. So I inclined my head up at a 30-degree angle, and there was a television set as big as the back wall. But what was playing? Chairman Mao? No. It was the Minnesota Timberwolves against the Dallas Mavericks. And it had hypnotized this audience from an ancient civilization who were doing these prodigies of building and you know. And then, when I finally surrendered and went to McDonald's for a cup of coffee, packed with young Chinese, every single one of them with a computer terminal and ears for most of them. And what are they doing with the computers? calculus, right? Advanced trigonometry. They're doing American computer games. You know, and I know I date myself, but Donkey Kong and that sort of stuff. Whatever the latest murderous version of Donkey Kong are. And then, as you walk through the streets and you look at the young, they're wired the same way the ghetto population in New York City is wired. And what are they listening to? American pop music, or what's called music these days. I don't mean Frank Sinatra. I mean tuneless rhythm pieces about killing police and things like that. Then I pick up the English language newspaper, and I'm still in Guangzhou. The English language newspaper, it's called China Daily, and it's a tabloid size, but the front page is the government recruiting 30,000 youthful employees, computer savvy, to spy on the internet so that transgressions can be funneled back to the secret police. So these two processes, anabolic and catabolic, if I can be pompous, building up Chinese civilization and tearing it down, are simultaneously at work. And finally I head over to the German embassy, which is now a high-priced hotel called the White Swan on a wonderful quadrangle that must be a half a mile long. Hotels at the end. I want to get some Chinese silk for my wife. And walking over on this quadrangle, if I see one, I see 50 American women, clearly American women, wheeling baby carriages with Chinese babies inside them. It is the world's leading exporter of human flesh as well into the institution of substitute family that we call adoption, because if you try to do that here, there are all sorts of, there's at least supposed to be all sorts of safeguards, but you don't need those safeguards to get a baby from China or Thailand or really any number of other countries. They're glad to take your money and transfer it. I spoke in Budapest, Hungary, and a minor part of that business, you could see the clientele was all American, because we're virtually the only country on earth that adopts strangers as our own children, and then wipes out their historic record, seals it so it's illegal to access that information. We adopt more people than all the rest of the countries in the world put together, which might not be strange if we were a child-loving country. But who here has seen any evidence that we are a child-loving country? So what on earth is going on? But like all these other things I've mentioned, going on sotto voce, behind the scenes, and never talked about in schools or on television. Okay, I think what I will do is just leaf through these last pages and share a nugget or two with you. Two powerful German minds, one associated with the First World War, Erich Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, sells more copies this year than it sold in the year he wrote it, and will continue to do that forever, because it's German young people talking about the adult world they've been recruited to kill in. And Remarque points not to a fan of causes. He said the First World War is the result of good German schooling. And then the other German name I want to point to is the famous theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was, I think, executed by Hitler, but I'm not sure of that. Bonhoeffer said the Second World War was the inevitable result of Prussian schooling, not one of the multi-causes. Once you destroy the critical faculty in a common population and set it in competition against one another, you've created a mighty machine that no army that links arms in brotherhood or hauls its wounded off the battlefield can possibly compete against. The only reason we won the Second World War, and I'm quoting Winston Churchill in the last volume of his 6-volume history of World War II, he's speaking directly to Germany in italics, and he said, "For God's sake, you have achieved feats of arms never imagined possible in the history of the world. You never fought a battle that you weren't outnumbered 4-1. You have no natural resources, and Russia would have been too big for you to take on, let alone taking on the whole world. And you held the world off for 4 years." He said, "It's enough. Pat yourself in the back and do something else, Germany." Well, I was so interested in that I hunted down a military college and got some texts to read about German military schooling. And it was such an eye-opener. The Germans knew that lockstep schooling and obedience were a way to create semi-human robots. At the same time, you can't manage a war with semi-human robots. So the command staff and the staff officers and even some of the line officers at the front, in fact, all the line officers at the front, were given an absolute carte blanche to override orders from central headquarters and adapt their tactics to what they saw in front of them. That sounds pretty sensible, doesn't it? You would have to look at the 60,000 pages of American military rules to know that if you did that and you got caught by, say, losing a battle, you were dead. Your career was over and you were behind bars. That's treasonous to contradict the orders of a superior. But the German High Command welcomed that contradiction. That's how they were able to stand against forces many times better equipped than they were and numerically larger there, because they were allowed to think at the top. They weren't allowed to think from the neck down, but at the top they were. That's what human resources can do for you. Not for you, because you are a human resource. That's what they can do with the people who spend the human resources. A fantastic power granted. Now quickly, leafing through. Okay, we're getting right to the end, guys. Wish I could. Here's the self-limiting part of the kind of schooling we're doing. You're actually seeing it play out in front of your eyes with the massive misery and the people with college degrees and PhDs that cannot find employment, nor will they ever be able to find employment unless that's all they do is go around and knock on doors. Jobs only come, crudely speaking, from 3 main sources. And the government's well aware of this and has been from our national beginning. They can come from the government creating jobs, but every economist worth his salt knows that all that does is take capital out of the productive economy and use it for non-productive purposes. So that's self-limiting because the economy will collapse if the government gets too big. The second source are the giant corporations that hire 10, 20, 30, 50, 100,000 people. And the trouble with that is that the logic of corporate thinking is always, the technical term is rationalize your equipment and your workforce. Never does a corporation say, we have enough, people love our product, you all are getting a bonus, and, stop worrying about your job. It's exactly the reverse. There are high-paid people every single day trying to test situations where you're not needed any longer. That's rationalizing the workforce. And I'll tell you a secret that I'll bet some people in this room know, but you're all going to know it now. If you have the power, like IBM does, to lay off 20,000 people in a single week, what happens to IBM stock when you do that? If you're innocent, you think it goes down. It goes through the roof. Every one of those people's a pension to pay, an hospitalization, a salary. You got to listen to moan and whine who have been worked too hard. So now I want you to dip into your knowledge of human nature. I don't think corporate people are innately any more amoral than anyone else. But if you're in a situation, maybe you have a mortgage on a $3 million home to pay. Maybe you have 50,000 stock options that are about to expire in 90 days. And all you have to do to get an immense accretion of wealth is to lay off 20,000 or 10,000 even. Or lay off 3,000, but put out in the grapevine that further job cuts will occur, and you and all the executive staff around you is rolling in dough. Now, if nobody is telling you that's illegal to do that, and you're left with your own native morality, and you believe with Charles Darwin or with Spinoza or with Calvin that most people are trash anyway, what exact barrier is there for you doing that with a good conscience? Does that happen in the land of the free? Well, you'll have to answer the question for yourself. But I'll say this to you, that your children and anybody you teach as a teacher in elementary school or college has an absolute right to have this information, to know these things, to know these are possible options. My daughter wrote me as a biology major when she was a senior at MIT, saying that her life was ruined, that biology majors are the laughingstock of the campus, and that everybody taking a tech degree was already being hired by corporations, not later, but they'd take a week off from MIT and come back with a bundle of money. She said, it's clear that I've been lied to, that the future belongs to the high-tech people, and I've missed my chance to become one. Well, maybe so. However, this country, Silicon Valley, and all of California and the high-tech states and cities are filled with foreign high-tech workers, because domestic high-tech workers not only reach a ceiling at about 60 or 70,000 a year, the few that get through that ceiling are the ones talked about in the papers, Most don't get through that ceiling. But after they're 40 years old, nobody wants them except at, something approaching minimum wage. Why should you want somebody trained on earlier generations of equipment to demand raises because they've hung around for a long time? You want the fresh blood, who will work for less, will work harder and longer, and then, of course, they don't realize the sand is running out of their glass, too. When you finally get annoyed with American workers, you just order up from Mr. Gates' Indian campus any number of proficient high-tech workers. It's a horrible career to pursue. It's a wonderfully powerful technology. But forget that unless you follow the third way of employment, there's nothing in it for you at all except amusement. I understand that 75% of the hits in New York State are on porno sites. It's 3 out of every 4. So if that's your bag. The third way to earn a living is the American way. It's creating your own job. And how do you do that? Your head has to be screwed on the right way. Instead of thinking, what can I do? You send kids out of school for a week and say, I want you to overhear conversation, to look at people on the street and to figure out what they want to buy, what they need. If you're going to a campus and everyone has open shirts on, they don't need a tie store in the neighborhood. On the other hand, if they're down in Wall Street or Madison Avenue, you couldn't have enough tie stores because they're all little and only a couple of customers can go to one. Everyone wants ties. You only wear your tie once. You wouldn't be caught dead wearing it twice. It would show that you were on the downward slope. So creating your own employment has always been the American way. That's why we were the magnet, the beacon for ordinary people all over the world. They saw that in creating your own employment, you not only got to write your own script, but you could go from poverty, as Andrew Carnegie was in deep poverty, to genuine wealth in 5 years. And if you wanted to be an international tycoon, you could add that in another 5 or 10 years. Because only a lunatic would want to spend their life adding to the number in their bank book, because it was going to be their deadbeat children. The drug takers who would get the money and they would run through it very quickly. Nevertheless, there are 3 ways to generate jobs. The government can generate jobs. It's utterly unproductive, and it puts to death the corporate economy because it takes the capital corporations need to tool up, retool, advertise, and so on. Then there's the corporate economy, but that's a nerve-wracking way to get employment because every day you're working there, somebody's trying to figure out how to get rid of you, and it's independent of how good you work. And the third way is to study the population and say, they need this, they need that, they need a better Browning, or whatever it is. Now, to deny our school children an understanding of this is genuinely to spit in the face of the creators of this nation and to treat the others, the little ones, as trash. So there. So thank you for coming.